The salt cellar sat in the middle of the Thornleigh breakfast table, and neither of them reached for it. That was the thing Cecily Harford noticed first. Not the silver, not the morning light across the cloth, not the quiet that had settled over the room, like something long practiced. She noticed that Evangeline's hand moved, that the cellar traveled the length of the mahogany without a sound, and that Julian received it without lifting his eyes from his plate. Two people at opposite ends of a table, passing small necessities between them with the ease of people who have never needed to look. Cecily was 16 and visiting for a fortnight, and she had spent the whole of yesterday talking about tulips. And this morning, she had been mid-sentence about tulips again, when the cellar moved and the sentence stopped in her mouth. Something in the gesture was so practiced, so utterly without effort, that it had taken her a full 3 seconds to understand why it made her throat feel strange. She set down her fork. "I thought you were married," Cecily said. "The way you pass the salt without looking." The breakfast room went still. Julian set down his coffee cup. Evangeline did not set anything down. She kept her eyes on the correspondence beside her plate, and the only sign that she had heard was the slight pause before she turned the letter over. Not quickly, but with the deliberate calm of a woman managing something that required managing. "Cecily," said Lady Philippa from her end of the table, her voice carrying the precise weight of a woman who wants to close a door without slamming it. "Tell me more about these tulips." Cecily obliged. The conversation moved on, but the salt cellar sat untouched in the center of the table for the remainder of breakfast, and the word married hung in the air above the silver and the cold toast and the morning's letters, occupying a room that had not permitted it in 15 years. This was the second morning of Cecily's visit, and the household of Thornleigh ran as it always ran when Lord Julian Thornleigh was in residence. Correctly, warmly, and at a careful distance. Thornleigh was Evangeline's house, had been hers since she married Marcus Thornleigh at 23 and become Viscountess Thornleigh before she was 27, when fever took Marcus in the 3rd week of August and left her with a house, a title, and a ward. The ward was Clementine, Julian's niece, Marcus's brother's daughter, orphaned at 4 months when Julian's wife, Adelaide, had died in the childbed, and Marcus himself had followed 6 months later. Julian had inherited Carrowby, 40 miles north, and the arrangement had organized itself around that distance with a tidiness that suited everyone who did not look at it directly. Julian's quarterly visits were events of structure. He arrived on Thursday, reviewed the estate accounts with Thornleigh's steward, dined with the household, attended Sunday service with Evangeline and Clementine, and departed before 12th night. The same courtesies were observed each time. The same conversations about drainage and the parish roof and Clementine's progress with her French. The same careful vocabulary of guardianship, which allowed them to speak of the child they both loved without speaking of anything else. Clementine herself was 15 now, and in 6 weeks she would travel to London for her first season under the nominal supervision of Lady Stroud. Her maternal grandmother, a woman of 68, whose letters arrived quarterly with the regularity of rent and the warmth of an invoice. Clementine bore this prospect with the enthusiasm of someone who did not yet know what a London drawing-room cost. She moved through Thornleigh and Carrowby alike, as though both houses were simply rooms in a larger home whose shape she had never needed to question. And she had been doing so since she was old enough to walk between them. Lady Philippa Hargrave had arrived the previous week to assist with Clementine's wardrobe preparations. She was Julian's cousin, 45, with the sharp eyes of a woman who had spent decades watching other people manage their arrangements and had long since stopped being surprised by what they chose not to say. It was Philippa who found Evangeline in the library that evening. The library at Thornleigh had a window seat on the east wall, wide enough for a person to sit with their knees drawn up and a book open across them, and the view from it was the Carrowby Road. Evangeline was not reading. She was holding the day's last letter, a formal sheet from Lady Stroud, requesting Clementine for the London season and proposing dates and arrangements with the confidence of a woman who expected compliance. And she had been sitting in the window seat for 20 minutes without opening it. She had read it once, standing at the writing desk. Then she had come here. She did not examine why. She opened the letter again in the window seat's fading light, and she read it a second time. And when she had finished, she looked out at the Carrowby Road in the dark. And something she had not allowed herself to notice arrived with the quiet certainty of a thing that has been true for a very long time. She only sat in this window seat on the nights Julian was at Carrowby. She folded the letter and did not move for another quarter hour. The following morning, Evangeline wrote to Lady Stroud accepting the season in principle. She drafted it at the writing desk in the estate office, copied it fair onto good paper, sealed it without rereading it, and handed it to the footman before she could find a reason to reconsider. The letter was gone from the house before 11. At 4 o'clock, she sat with Philippa over tea in the small parlor, while Clementine's measurements were being discussed with the dressmaker in the next room. The sound of Clementine's voice carried through the wall. Bright, pleased, arguing cheerfully about whether pale yellow suited her. And Philippa poured her own second cup and said, without particular preamble, "The county has known what this household is for 9 years, Evangeline. It is waiting to see whether you will." Evangeline refilled Philippa's cup, even though it had not been empty. "Clementine will need at least 4 evening gowns," Evangeline said. "The dressmaker believes 3 will suffice, but she has not seen a London ballroom." "I am not talking about Clementine's gowns," Philippa said. "I know what you are talking about," Evangeline said, and her voice was perfectly level. "More cake?" Philippa accepted the cake. She did not push further. She was a perceptive woman, and she understood the difference between a door that was locked and a door that had simply never been tried. That evening, Evangeline stood at the library window as the light left the sky, the letter already gone and irretrievable, and behind her, the window seat sat empty. Julian returned to Thornleigh the following Thursday, as scheduled, for the first of the wardrobe consultations he had been asked to attend as Clementine's co-guardian. He arrived at 2:30, took tea with Clementine and Philippa, reviewed 2 letters from the London solicitor regarding the season's financial arrangements, and remained for dinner. Evangeline reorganized the household schedule. It was a small adjustment, a matter of ensuring that the morning consultations fell when Philippa was present, that the afternoon walks included Clementine, that the evenings arranged themselves so that the drawing room was occupied by several people or by none. Mrs. Beechey, Thornleigh's housekeeper, watched from the corridor on the second morning and said nothing. She had been watching for 15 years. The parish assembly arrived on the Friday, a gathering of 20 or so neighbors in the assembly rooms above the coaching inn, a fiddler, and the county's good-natured determination to dance, whether the weather suited or not. The evening proceeded through 2 country dances and a progressive reel, and then the reel required partners to stand up in a set of 8, and the set required 2 lines, and the lines required that Evangeline and Julian stand opposite each other. There was no graceful way to refuse. They both understood this. Julian put his right hand to her waist. Evangeline put her left hand into his. The music started, and 8 bars passed with the reliable indifference of music that has no interest in what it costs the people dancing to it. His hand at her waist was warm through the silk of her dress. Her hand in his was still. They moved through the figure, the crossing, the turn, the progression down the set. And they did not speak, because the dance did not require speech. And when the 8 bars ended, and the figure completed, and the music moved on to the next pair, Julian released her hand. His hand at her waist remained for 1 beat past the last note. Then he released her. They returned to opposite sides of the room and spoke to other people for the remainder of the evening. And the space between them across the assembly room floor was exactly the same as it had always been. 2 days later, Clementine found Evangeline arranging flowers in the morning room. "Aunt Ava," Clementine said, settling onto the window seat with the ease of someone who had been settling onto window seats in this house since she was 4 years old. "Why does Uncle Julian never stay past 12th night?" Evangeline set a stem of late chrysanthemum into the vase. "Caroby requires him." "But Thornleigh requires him too," Clementine said. "The east drainage wants looking at, and Mr. Harwick said so to Mrs. Beechey last Tuesday." "Mr. Harwick's concerns are noted," Evangeline said. "Uncle Julian will attend to them before he leaves." "He always attends to things before he leaves," Clementine said, not unkindly. "He's very good at leaving." Evangeline placed another stem. She did not answer. From the doorway, Lady Philippa watched the exchange, and then she moved quietly back into the corridor without announcing herself. Lady Stroud arrived on the Thursday of the following week. She had written to say she would attend a dinner at Thornleigh to discuss the season's final arrangements, and Evangeline had written back with a date, a menu, and the names of the proposed guests: the Reverend Aldwyn, Sir Giles Merton and his wife, Lady Philippa, Clementine, Julian, and herself. 10 at table. A proper dinner. The dining room was dressed for it. 4 removes, good wine, the candelabra that had been Marcus's mother's. Clementine sat 2 places from Julian and wore her best blue, and her hair had been arranged by Evangeline's own maid that afternoon. She was visibly pleased with herself, in the way of 15-year-olds who do not yet know that formal dinners have purposes beyond the food. The first remove passed without incident. The vicar spoke about the new vestry roof. Sir Giles spoke about his drainage scheme, which had been the county's primary topic since September. Lady Stroud was gracious, precise, and watched Clementine with the focused attention of a woman conducting an appraisal. Between the fish and the roast, Lady Stroud set down her fish fork and said, "I wonder if I might raise a matter of some delicacy." The table did not quite go still. People continued to hold their glasses and their cutlery, but the quality of the attention in the room changed in the way that attention changes when 10 people simultaneously understand that something is about to be said that cannot be unsaid. "I have been in correspondence with Clementine's school," Lady Stroud said. Her voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a woman who believed she was performing a service. "I have seen several of the letters Clementine has written home over the past 3 years." She looked at Clementine, and then at Julian, and then at Evangeline. In those letters, she refers to Lord Julian as Papa. Clementine's face went from pleased to red in the space of 2 seconds. Her eyes filled immediately, and she looked down at the tablecloth and pressed her lips together. Julian set down his fork. The sound of it against the porcelain was very small in the silence. Across the candles, Evangeline looked at him. She had not looked at him directly, not in the same room, not across a table, in years. She did so now, and he looked back. and the candles between them were very still because the windows were shut against the November cold, and there was no draught to move them. "I raise this," Lady Stroud continued, "not to cause distress to Clementine, who I am certain meant no harm. I raise it because the arrangement between Lord Julian and Lady Thornleigh is, to say the least, unusual. And as Clementine's nearest maternal relation, I feel that the question of how the household presents itself to London ought to be discussed before she enters society." The Reverend Aldwyn studied his wine-glass with the concentration of a man who wished he were elsewhere. Sir Giles's wife had put down her napkin. Lady Philippa, at the far end of the table, was watching Evangeline. Evangeline looked at Lady Stroud. She did not look at Julian again. "Thank you, Lady Stroud," she said, and her voice was warm and entirely composed, "for your candor. It is a subject that deserves consideration, and I am glad you have raised it in company where it can be examined properly." She turned to Sir Giles. "Now, Sir Giles, you were saying last week that the new drainage scheme had attracted some interest from the county surveyor. I should very much like to hear more about that before the roast arrives." Sir Giles, who was a practical man and not unkind, took the subject gratefully and held it for the remainder of the remove. The dinner finished. The arrangement was no longer private. The morning after Lady Stroud's dinner, Evangeline was in the still room at 7:30, checking the inventory of preserved goods against the winter accounts. It was methodical work, the kind that required counting and notation and kept the hands occupied, and she had been at it for 40 minutes when Mrs. Beechey came in. Mrs. Beechey closed the door behind her. She was 60, had been at Thornleigh since before Evangeline arrived, and she said what she had come to say without sitting down. "I have not spoken of this before," Mrs. Beechey said. "None of us has. But after last night, I thought you ought to know what the household has observed." Evangeline set down her pen. "You use the library window seat on the nights Lord Julian is at Carrowby," Mrs. Beechey said. "Not on the nights he is here. On the nights he is 40 miles away. You sit in that window seat after dinner. You have done so for as long as I have been paying attention, which is 9 years." She paused. "When Lord Julian arrives on Thursdays, the kitchen has his preferred breakfast on the table by 8, without being asked. You reorganized the household schedule this visit so that you were never in a room alone with him. And last Tuesday, when the East Drainage letter arrived from Mr. Harwick, you read it twice before you put it down, and Mr. Harwick addressed it to Lord Julian. The still room was quiet. Outside, the November garden was gray. "I am not saying this to cause you pain," Mrs. Beechey said. "I am saying it because Lady Stroud named something last night in front of 10 people, and the something she named is not what she thinks it is. She thinks it is a scandal. The rest of us know it is something else entirely." She looked at Evangeline steadily. "That is all I wish to say." She left, pulling the door shut behind her with the care of someone who understands that some rooms need to be quiet afterward. Evangeline did not move from her place at the still room table. She looked at the inventory ledger open in front of her, and the columns of numbers she had been counting, and the pen she had set down, and she did not pick any of them up. An hour later, she heard the door. Julian came in without knocking. Not with intrusion, but with the manner of a man who had stood outside a door for some time and finally decided. He did not speak. He crossed the still room to where she stood beside the shelves of preserves, and he took her hand, her whole hand, not the fingertips, not a formal touch, but the whole of it, and held it for a count of 10. His hand was warm, and his grip was firm, and he did not say anything. He released her. He left. Evangeline stood in the still room for 20 minutes after the door closed. The letter from Lady Stroud arrived at noon, delivered by her own footman from her lodgings in the village. It was short and direct. Lady Stroud proposed, in the interests of Clementine's London prospects and the household's dignity, that Clementine be removed to her custody in London until such time as the situation at Thornleigh resolved itself on proper terms. She was, she wrote, prepared to act on this proposal within the fortnight. Evangeline read the letter at the still-room table. She set it face down on the wood. She sat with it for a long time. Then she picked it up and read it again. And the second reading was different from the first, because on the second reading she understood that the letter was not the problem. The letter was the consequence of a problem she had been maintaining for 15 years under the name of peace. She had never asked. That was the thing. In 15 years of quarterly visits and careful distances and window seats on Caroby nights, she had never once asked the question that would have forced the arrangement to become a choice rather than a condition. She had called her silence dignity. She had called his silence respect. Neither of them had called it by its right name, and now Lady Stroud was proposing to take Clementine away, and the county had known for 9 years, and Mrs. Beechey had kept a tally, and still she had not asked. She got up and went to find pen and paper. She sat down at the desk. She did not write. The house was quiet by 11. Clementine had gone to bed subdued. Lady Philippa had retired. Mrs. Beechey had made her final rounds. The candles in the upstairs corridors had been snuffed one by one, and Thornleigh settled into the particular dark of a November night when there is no moon and the frost is beginning. Evangeline came downstairs at 11:30. She had told herself she was coming for a book. She knew she was not coming for a book. The drawing-room door was not fully closed. Light came through the gap, a single lamp on the side table, low. She pushed the door open. Julian was sitting in the chair beside the cold fireplace with a glass of brandy on the arm. He had not drunk it. He was sitting with the stillness of a man who has been in the same position for a long time and has not moved because movement would require deciding what to do next. Evangeline did not sit down. She stood in the middle of the room, and she looked at him, and she said, "Have you ever loved me?" She asked it plainly, no preamble, no softening, no apology for the hour or the directness, just the question, in the first person, spoken aloud in this room for the first time in 15 years. Julian looked at her. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3 and 4 and 5, and the man who had spoken in the House of Lords for 15 years, who had argued the drainage bill and the land reform correspondence and a dozen addresses that had required precision and composure, could not produce a syllable. His mouth was not closed. He was looking at her. The words were simply not there. 6 seconds. "That is my answer," Evangeline said quietly. "Evangeline," he said. His voice came back to him in a rush, and he began to rise from the chair. "Don't," she said, not cruelly, but with a firmness that stopped him before he was fully standing. "Whatever you were about to say, I don't want it now. You had 6 seconds and a question that deserved an answer, and you gave me silence. I know what the silence means. I have known what it meant for longer than either of us ought to be comfortable with." Julian stood in the half-risen position for a moment, and then he sat back down, because there was nothing else to do. "I am going to Bath in the morning," Evangeline said. "I am going to take the waters and write to Clementine and think about what I want. Not what is proper, not what serves the arrangement. What I want." She crossed to where he sat and took the brandy glass from his hand. He released it without resistance and set it on the mantel. Then she turned back to him and placed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. Not gently, not tenderly, with the pressure of someone checking whether something is still running. 6 seconds. 6. She could feel his heart under her hand. She could feel it clearly. She took her hand back. "Good night, Julian," she said, and walked out of the drawing room and did not come back downstairs. At 4 in the morning, a lamp burned in the estate office. Julian sat at the writing desk with a sheet of paper in front of him and wrote a letter to his solicitor in London, instructing him to begin the process of selling Carrowby. He named the price, the terms, and the disposition of the proceeds. Into trust for Clementine, in full, irrevocably. He sealed the letter. He walked to the hall, put on his coat, and rode to the village himself to post it before dawn, because he did not trust himself not to retrieve it if it sat on the Thornleigh hall table until morning. Evangeline spent 6 weeks in Bath. She took rooms in a quiet street near the pump room, drank the waters as prescribed, and walked in the mornings along the river when the frost had not made the paths treacherous. She wrote to Clementine every week, long letters about the Bath shops and the concerts and the particular quality of the light on the weir. And Clementine wrote back with the cheerful detail of someone who was 16 and had recently discovered that the world extended considerably beyond Thornleigh's grounds. No letter came from Julian. She did not expect one. She had not asked for one. But the absence was its own information, and she filed it alongside Mrs. Beechey's tally and the weight of his hand holding hers in the still room. And she sat with all of it in the Bath lodgings and thought about what she wanted. She returned to Thornleigh on a Tuesday in January, when the ground was hard and the hedgerows were bare and the light came low and cold across the fields. Mrs. Beechey met her in the entrance hall and said, before Evangeline had removed her coat, "Lord Julian has taken the east wing. He moved in 3 weeks ago. He has not come to the main house or attempted to see you. He takes his meals alone and exercises his horse each morning at 9. Evangeline handed over her coat and gloves. "There is a letter," Mrs. Beechey said, and produced a single folded sheet from her apron pocket. Evangeline carried it to the morning room and opened it. The handwriting was Julian's. It was not long. "Carrowby is sold. The proceeds are placed in trust for Clementine, as I have instructed my solicitor to confirm to you directly. I have installed myself in the east wing, which I understand is the furthest available from the drawing room. I will not press you. I will not ask the question back. You owe me nothing. I am here because it is the only honest place I have left to be." That was all. Evangeline read it twice. She folded it and placed it inside the cover of the novel she had brought from Bath, the one she had read twice on the journey and barely retained. She did not go to the east wing. 3 weeks passed. His presence at Thornleigh was not demanding. She heard him cross the courtyard at 7 each morning. The particular sound of his boot on the stone, which she had not known she knew until she heard it outside her bedroom window and recognized it without having to look. His horse went out at 9. He dined alone in the east wing small dining room. He attended to Thornleigh's estate matters through Mr. Harwick, without requiring her involvement. He was simply there, in the way that things are there when they have stopped pretending to be elsewhere. On the 22nd day after her return, Evangeline put on her outdoor coat and walked to the parish church alone. Reverend Aldwin was in the vestry, writing his Sunday address. He was a mild man, methodical, and he had known Evangeline since she arrived at Thornleigh as a new bride. He set down his pen when she came in. "I should like the banns published," Evangeline said. The Reverend looked at her over his spectacles. "Lord Julian Thornleigh and myself," she said. 3 Sundays as required." "I see." The the Reverend said. He picked up his pen. I will need Lord Julian's. I will attend to Lord Julian, Evangeline said. Please publish the banns, Reverend Aldwyn. He wrote the names in the register. She walked home in the cold and did not tell Julian. The first reading of the banns took place on Sunday morning before a congregation of 32, in a church that had known both of them for 15 years. Evangeline sat in the Thornleigh pew. Julian sat beside her, as he did on Sundays, because the East Wing did not have its own pew, and he had not yet found a reason to sit elsewhere. When Reverend Aldwyn read the names, Julian Thornleigh, Viscount, Bachelor of this parish; Evangeline Thornleigh, Viscountess Dowager, Widow of this parish. The church did not make a sound. 32 people who had known the arrangement for 9 years sat with the information and let it settle. Julian did not move beside her. He did not look at her. He looked at the pulpit with the expression of a man who has just been informed of something he had not been told was coming, and who is determining whether it is the best thing that has ever happened to him. At the church gate afterward, in the cold January light, Evangeline stopped beside him, and the congregation moved past them in pairs and clusters, and when they were nearly alone, she said, I asked you a question in the drawing room 8 weeks ago. I should like the answer you could not give me then. Julian looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man without words, but the silence of a man choosing which words to begin with. The year Marcus died, he said. 6 months after Adelaide. I came to Thornleigh for the funeral, and you were standing in the kitchen garden because you could not bear to be inside, and you were pulling dead stalks out of the ground in the rain with your bare hands. And you did not hear me come through the gate. I stood there for 10 minutes watching you work, and I knew then. I did not say anything because you were a widow of 4 months, and I was a widower of 6 months, and Marcus was not yet cold in the ground, and saying it would have been... I thought it would have been a desecration. He paused. I went to Carrowby because staying would have required a vocabulary I did not possess. And then, around Clementine's 7th year, I understood that I looked forward to the 40-mile journey more than anything else in my life. Every quarter, those 40 miles. That was the event I lived toward. And I told myself the silence was the most honest thing I could offer you. Evangeline listened without interrupting. The silence was not cowardice, Julian said. I want you to know that. I believed it. I believed that speaking would have put a burden on you that you had not asked for. And I was wrong. I have been wrong for 12 years, and I knew it for at least 8 of them. And I kept the conviction because it was easier than the alternative. He stopped. That is the answer, all of it. There is nothing else I am keeping back. Evangeline looked at him for a moment. You will remain in the East Wing, she said, until Clementine returns from London. She ought to be home before she hears this from anyone else. We marry the Sunday after she is back. Julian said simply, yes. And you will stop taking your meals alone, Evangeline said. That is unnecessary, and Mrs. Beechey is walking twice the distance she should. He nodded once. Yes. Evangeline turned and walked back toward Thornleigh, and he fell into step beside her, and the frozen road was wide enough for 2. On the Tuesday morning after the first banns, Evangeline crossed the courtyard. She had not been to the East Wing since Julian had taken up residence there. It was the furthest part of the house from the drawing room, a set of rooms that looked onto the kitchen garden. The same kitchen garden where she had pulled dead stalks out of the ground in the rain 23 years ago, the morning after Marcus's funeral. She had not thought about that morning in years. She thought about it now, crossing the courtyard stones in the January cold. She knocked. Julian opened the door himself. He had sent his man away that morning, which she did not know. but which she understood when she saw him standing there in his shirt sleeves with his coat on the chair behind him, and no one else in the room. He rose when she entered, because he always rose when she entered a room, and that habit had never changed in 15 years of quarterly visits and careful distances. Evangeline crossed the room to him. She raised both hands and took his face between them, her palms flat against his jaw, her thumbs on the planes of his cheekbones. And she held his face and looked at him for a moment. He was very still. He put his hands around her wrists, not to move them, but simply to hold them there. And his grip was steady and certain, the whole hand, not the fingertips. She kissed him, fully, without hesitation, for a count of 8, when she pulled back. She did not release his face. She stayed with her palms against his jaw and her thumbs on his cheekbones and looked at him from 3 inches away. And he was looking back at her with the expression of a man who has spent 12 years choosing silence and has just understood what the choosing cost. She released him. She stepped back. "The second banns are Sunday," she said. "I know," he said. She left the east wing and crossed the courtyard back to the main house, and the frost on the stones caught the morning light, and the kitchen garden to her left was bare and waiting for spring. The second and third banns were read on consecutive Sundays to a congregation that grew slightly each week as the county's curiosity arranged itself into church attendance. Lady Stroud, informed by letter of the banns and the proposed date, wrote a reply that was, for Lady Stroud, almost warm. The arrangement, she wrote, had resolved itself on proper terms. She was gratified. Clementine might remain at Thornleigh. Clementine herself returned from London in February, 2 weeks before the wedding date. With a trunk containing 7 pairs of new gloves, news of 2 dance partners whose names she produced with great significance and then immediately retracted, and an opinion about London millinery that she delivered at length over dinner on the first evening home. Evangeline told her that evening, in the morning room, after the household had gone to bed. Clementine sat on the window seat, her usual place, the one she had occupied since she was 4 years old, and listened. When Evangeline finished, Clementine was quiet for a moment. "I have been calling him Papa in my letters since I was 9, Clementine said. "I thought everyone knew." "Everyone did," Evangeline said. "Except me." Clementine looked at her. "Are you happy?" "Yes," Evangeline said. It was the simplest true thing she had said in 15 years. "Good," said Clementine, and unfolded herself from the window seat and kissed Evangeline on the cheek and went to bed. The wedding took place on the Sunday after Clementine came home, in the same church where the banns had been read, before the same 32 people who had been there for the first reading and approximately 14 more who had found reasons to attend. Reverend Aldwin performed the ceremony with the composed satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for this particular entry in the register for some time. Lady Philippa wept, which she would have denied if anyone had mentioned it. Mrs. Beechey did not weep. She stood at the back of the church with her hands folded and her expression entirely composed. And if there was any feeling in her face, it was the particular satisfaction of someone who has kept a 15-year tally and watched it resolve correctly. Clementine wore pale yellow, which did suit her, and held Evangeline's flowers during the ring, and stood between them on the church steps afterward in the cold February light. The next morning, Thornleigh's breakfast room was set for 3. Both places at the ends of the table were occupied. Clementine sat between them in her usual chair, working through her toast and recounting something a dance partner had said in London that she had previously withheld on grounds of embarrassment, and now saw no reason to keep to herself. The morning light came through the east windows. The coffee was hot. The fire had been laid since 6. The salt cellars sat in the center of the table. Evangeline looked at it. She extended her hand across the cloth, and Julian picked up the cellar and slid it toward her. And when it reached her fingers, she did not immediately take it. She left her hand where it was, and his fingers rested on the silver beside hers, and neither of them withdrew. Clementine, in the middle of her account of the dance partner, did not pause. Mrs. Beechey, who had come to the doorway with the second coffee pot, looked at the table, at the 2 hands on the silver, at the 3 places set and occupied, at the morning going forward the way mornings go forward when the thing that has been unfinished is finished. And she turned and walked back to the kitchen. She closed the door behind her. She stood in the kitchen passage for a moment, alone, and then she laughed.